In 1922, a woman named Molly Maggia went to the dentist complaining of tooth pain. The dentist examined her mouth and found her jawbone was disintegrating, literally crumbling. He touched it, and a piece came off in his hand. Within weeks, her entire lower jaw fell out. The bones in her mouth were so soft they could be scooped out with a spoon. She died in 1922 at age 24. The death certificate listed the cause as ulcerative stomatitis, mouth inflammation. That was a lie. She died from radiation poisoning. Her bones were radioactive. Her body was literally glowing in the dark when they buried her. And her employer, the United States Radium Corporation, knew exactly what was killing her. They'd known for years. Their own scientists had confirmed that radium was deadly. Their medical consultants had warned them. They knew the women painting radium on watch dials were being poisoned, and they lied about it. They covered it up. They paid doctors to falsify death certificates. They hired scientists to produce fake research claiming radium was safe. They fought the dying women in court for years while their bodies fell apart. The Radium Girls were young women who worked in factories painting watch dials with radium-based luminous paint. The paint glowed in the dark, which made it perfect for watches, instrument panels, and military equipment. The work seemed safe, even glamorous. The women were told radium was harmless. Some were told it was beneficial, that it would make their cheeks rosy and their skin glow. Between 1917 and 1926, radium poisoning killed dozens of these women. It destroyed their jaws, shattered their bones, caused tumors and anemia, and led to agonizing deaths. The companies employing them knew radium was lethal and covered it up for profit. This is the story of the Radium Girls. The women who were poisoned for corporate profit. The lawsuit that established workers' rights to sue employers for occupational hazards. The corporate cover-up that shows exactly how little companies value human life when money is at stake. And it's a playbook that corporations still use today. Radium was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898. It's a radioactive element that emits energy as it decays. That energy glows. Radium produces a greenish-blue luminescence that doesn't require an external light source. It just glows constantly. In the early 1900s, nobody understood radiation. The Curies knew radium was energetic and powerful, but they didn't fully grasp how dangerous it was. Marie Curie herself died from radiation exposure in 1934. By the 1910s, radium had become a miracle substance. Companies marketed radium water as a health tonic. Radium spas promised therapeutic benefits. Wealthy people drank radium-laced beverages, thinking it would cure ailments and boost vitality. The element was seen as life-enhancing, not life-threatening. Then World War I created massive demand for luminous watch dials. Soldiers needed to read watches and instrument panels in the dark. Glow-in-the-dark paint using radium was the perfect solution. It didn't need charging from light. It didn't fade quickly. It just glowed constantly. Several companies started producing radium-based luminous paint. The largest was the United States Radium Corporation, established in 1917 in Orange, New Jersey. They manufactured Undark, a radium paint used on watch dials, aircraft instruments, and military equipment. Manufacturing the paint required workers to apply it to tiny watch dials with incredible precision. The dials were small. The numbers were smaller. The work required fine motor control and attention to detail, so the companies hired young women. Women's hands were considered more delicate and suited for detailed work. Women could be paid less than men. Women were seen as more compliant and less likely to complain. They were the perfect workforce for tedious, underpaid labor. The factories employed hundreds of women, mostly teenagers and women in their early 20s. They came from working-class families. Many were immigrants or first-generation Americans. They needed the money. The jobs paid well compared to other factory work available to women, about $20 per week, which was decent money in the 1920s. The work seemed safe and even fun. The paint glowed. The women would joke about glowing themselves. They'd paint their nails, teeth, and faces with the luminous paint for parties. Some would paint their clothing to glow in the dark. They'd walk home from work, literally glowing, their clothes, skin, and hair contaminated with radioactive dust. And the technique they were taught to paint the watch dials ensured they'd be poisoned. The painting technique was called lip pointing. Here's how it worked. Each woman had a small brush, a jar of radium paint, and a tray of watch dials to paint. The paint was thick, and the brushes would lose their fine point quickly. To maintain precision, the women were instructed to lick the brush between each number painted. Lick, dip in paint, paint a number. Lick, dip, paint, over and over, hundreds of times per day. Every time they licked the brush, they ingested radium. The radioactive particles accumulated in their bodies. Radium is chemically similar to calcium, so the body deposits it in bones and teeth. It concentrates there and emits radiation constantly, destroying tissue from the inside. The women didn't know this. They were told radium was harmless. Supervisors demonstrated the lip-pointing technique and insisted it was safe. Some managers claimed radium had health benefits, that it would strengthen their bones and improve their complexion. The reality? Every brush lick was a tiny dose of poison. Over months and years, the radium accumulated. It concentrated in jaws, spines, and bones. It emitted alpha radiation that destroyed surrounding tissue. The women were slowly killing themselves with every shift they worked. And the companies knew. Scientists working for the radium companies understood radium was dangerous. They wore protective equipment when handling radium. They used lead screens and tongs. They took precautions to avoid exposure, but they never told the women painting the dials. They never provided protective equipment. They never warned them to stop licking the brushes. They just let the women keep poisoning themselves because providing protection would slow production and reduce profits. The first deaths started appearing around 1922. Women who'd worked at radium dial painting factories began experiencing strange symptoms. At first, doctors didn't connect the cases. The symptoms seemed unrelated. Different women at different factories were experiencing similar problems, but medical professionals treated each case individually without recognizing the pattern. Tooth decay and jaw pain were common early symptoms. Women would go to dentists complaining of toothaches. Dentists would find teeth literally falling out of diseased gums. When they examined the jawbone, it was soft and crumbling. Pieces would break off when touched. The bone was necrotic, dead tissue rotting in their mouths while they were still alive. Doctors called it radium jaw. The radium concentrated in the jawbone caused tissue death on a cellular level. The bone would develop holes, become porous like Swiss cheese, and eventually collapse entirely. Women's jaws would literally fall apart in pieces. Some lost their entire lower jaws, removed surgically in desperate attempts to stop the spread of necrosis, or fallen out in fragments over weeks and months. Eating became impossible. Speaking became difficult. The pain was constant and excruciating. One woman, Amelia Maggia, Molly's sister, suffered for years before dying in 1922. Her entire jaw had to be removed. She lived for weeks with no lower jaw, unable to eat solid food, in constant pain, before finally dying from the progression of radiation poisoning throughout her body. But jaw problems were just the beginning. As radium accumulated in bones throughout the body, it caused systemic damage that affected every organ system. Anemia became severe as radium destroyed bone marrow, the body's blood cell factory. Women became exhausted, pale, and weak. They couldn't walk upstairs without becoming breathless. They fainted regularly. Their bodies couldn't produce enough red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. Some required repeated transfusions just to stay alive, though transfusions provided only temporary relief, since the radium kept destroying new blood cells as fast as they were created. Bone fractures became common and devastating. Radium made bones brittle and weak by disrupting normal bone formation. Women would break bones from minor impacts that shouldn't cause injury. Some broke ribs while coughing, others broke legs while walking. One woman's spine fractured while she was sleeping. The radium had weakened the vertebrae until they couldn't support her body weight anymore. She woke up paralyzed from a compression fracture that occurred without any trauma. Tumors developed throughout their bodies. Radium caused sarcomas, malignant bone tumors, that grew rapidly and painfully. The tumors would appear in jaws, spines, hips, and skulls. They grew aggressively, causing severe pain and disfigurement. The tumors would spread, metastasize to other bones and organs, and eventually kill. Surgery to remove tumors was often impossible because the surrounding bone was too weak to heal properly. And the most horrifying symptom, their bodies glowed in the dark. The radium was so concentrated in their bones that if you turned off the lights in their hospital rooms, you could see a faint greenish glow emanating from their bodies. It wasn't bright, but it was visible, an eerie luminescence coming from inside their skeletons. When some women died and were autopsied, their organs glowed under the pathologist's knife. Their bones glowed when exposed. Their breath was radioactive. You could measure radiation being exhaled from their lungs. When they were buried, their bodies continued glowing in their coffins. Years later, when some bodies were exhumed for investigations, they were still radioactive. They're still radioactive today, over a century later. Some radium girls buried in the 1920s have graves that register radiation on Geiger counters even now. The deaths were agonizing. Radium poisoning is slow, painful, and incurable. Women would suffer for months or years as their bodies deteriorated. Bones would break, tumors would grow, anemia would worsen, and there was no treatment, no cure, just suffering until death. Molly Maggia, the woman whose jaw fell out, died after years of suffering. Before her death, her entire lower jaw was removed. The radium had destroyed so much bone that her mouth was just a gaping wound. She couldn't eat solid food. She was in constant pain. She finally died in 1922, and the company claimed it was ulcerative stomatitis, a dental problem, not radiation poisoning. They lied because admitting it was radiation poisoning would mean accepting liability, and that would cost money. The United States Radium Corporation knew radium was deadly as early as 1924. Their own scientists confirmed it. Dr. Harrison Martland, a medical examiner in New Jersey, studied the dial painters and proved radium was accumulating in their bones and causing fatal radiation poisoning. Martland published his findings in 1925 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. He provided clear evidence. The women were dying from radium poisoning caused by ingesting radium paint at work. The company's response? Deny everything. They hired scientists to produce contradictory research claiming radium was safe. They paid doctors to falsify death certificates, listing causes like syphilis, jaw infections, or tuberculosis, instead of radium poisoning. They launched a PR campaign claiming the women's deaths were due to poor hygiene or moral failings, not workplace exposure. They specifically tried to blame syphilis. Syphilis can cause jaw deterioration in late stages, so the company suggested these women were promiscuous and diseased. It was slander designed to discredit dying women and avoid liability, and they fought lawsuits viciously. In 1927, 5 former dial painters, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice, sued the United States Radium Corporation. They became known as the Radium Girls. Their case was simple. The company had poisoned them through negligent workplace practices. The company knew radium was dangerous and failed to protect workers. The women deserved compensation for their suffering and medical expenses. The company fought the lawsuit for years. They used every legal tactic to delay and obstruct. They filed motion after motion. They demanded endless medical examinations. They questioned the women's character. They hired expert witnesses to claim radium wasn't the cause of their illnesses, and they waited. They knew the women were dying. Every delay meant some plaintiffs might die before the case concluded, weakening the lawsuit. The legal battle became national news. Newspapers covered the Radium Girls' struggle. The public was outraged by the company's behavior, watching young women literally dying while a corporation fought them in court to avoid paying for their suffering. In 1928, the case was finally settled out of court. The women received $10,000 each, about $175,000 in 2025 dollars, plus $600 annually for medical expenses, and all legal costs paid. The company admitted no wrongdoing. They just paid to make the case go away. $10,000 for destroying a human life, for years of suffering, for bones disintegrating and tumors growing and agonizing death. That's what a corporation decided a poisoned worker's life was worth. The Radium Girls case established a legal precedent. Workers have the right to sue employers for occupational hazards. Before this case, it was nearly impossible for workers to hold companies accountable for workplace injuries or illnesses. The case changed workers' compensation laws. It influenced occupational safety regulations. It contributed to the eventual establishment of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in 1970. It proved that corporations will lie, cover up, and fight dying workers in court rather than accept responsibility for harming them. And it showed that sometimes public pressure and legal action can force accountability. But accountability came too late for most Radium Girls. Dozens died before their lawsuit concluded. Many more died in the years after. The compensation they received didn't cure them. Radium poisoning has no cure. They were dying, and money couldn't stop it. The radium industry continued for decades after the Radium Girls case, but practices changed. Companies stopped using the lip-pointing technique. They provided protective equipment. They implemented safety protocols. They acknowledged radium was dangerous and required handling precautions. Why the change? Not because they suddenly cared about workers, because lawsuits became expensive, because regulations were imposed, because the Radium Girls lawsuit made it clear that negligence would cost money. Corporations don't protect workers out of moral obligation. They protect workers when failing to do so becomes more expensive than implementing safety measures. That's the lesson of the Radium Girls. Corporate safety improvements don't come from ethics. They come from legal liability and financial consequences. The Radium Girls story isn't ancient history. It's the blueprint corporations still use when caught harming workers or customers. Step 1. Deny the problem. Claim the product or practice is safe, despite internal evidence showing harm. Step 2. Produce contradictory research. Fund scientists to create doubt. Hire experts to question independent findings. Step 3. Blame the victims. Suggest the harm is due to personal choices, not the product. Step 4. Fight lawsuits aggressively. Delay, obstruct, and wait for plaintiffs to die or give up. Step 5. Settle without admitting wrongdoing. Pay the minimum necessary to make the problem go away without accepting liability. This isn't theoretical. This is what happened with tobacco. Companies knew cigarettes caused cancer by 1953. They denied it, funded contradictory research, fought regulation for decades, and settled lawsuits in 1998 without admitting wrongdoing. Radium Girls Playbook. Companies knew asbestos caused cancer and lung disease by the 1930s. They covered it up for decades. Workers died from mesothelioma, while companies denied responsibility. Radium Girls Playbook. Lead paint. Companies knew lead paint poisoned children by the 1920s. They fought regulation for decades. Children suffered brain damage while companies claimed lead was safe. Radium Girls Playbook. Opioids. Purdue Pharma knew OxyContin was addictive. They marketed it as safe anyway. They funded doctors and studies claiming it wasn't addictive. 500,000 plus people died in the opioid epidemic. Purdue filed bankruptcy to avoid full accountability. Radium Girls Playbook. Teflon and PFAS. DuPont knew Teflon chemicals contaminated water and caused cancer. They dumped them anyway. They covered it up for decades. Communities were poisoned while DuPont denied responsibility. Radium Girls Playbook. Roundup and glyphosate. Monsanto and Bayer knew Roundup likely caused cancer. They marketed it as safe. They're now fighting thousands of lawsuits from people who developed cancer after using Roundup. Radium Girls Playbook. Every single case follows the same pattern. Deny, delay, discredit, settle without admitting fault. The Radium Girls proved this playbook works. Companies can knowingly harm people, cover it up, and face only financial penalties. Never criminal charges. Never prison time for executives. Just settlements and fines that are smaller than the profits they made from the harmful product. The United States Radium Corporation continued operating for decades after poisoning its workers. They changed their name. They diversified. They continued making money. No executives faced criminal charges for knowingly poisoning workers. The same thing happens today. Purdue Pharma executives who pushed OxyContin knowing it was addictive, no criminal charges. Bayer executives selling Roundup knowing it likely caused cancer, no criminal charges. Tech executives knowing their platforms harm children's mental health, no criminal charges. Because corporations aren't people, legally. The company might pay fines or settlements, but the individuals who made decisions to harm people rarely face personal consequences. That's why the pattern continues. The Radium Girls established that workers could sue companies for harm, but it didn't establish that executives who knowingly harm workers should go to prison. So they keep doing it. Different products, same playbook. Harm people, cover it up, fight liability, settle when caught, continue operating. The Radium Girls died for a legal precedent that changed workers' rights, but didn't prevent future corporate harm. It made harming workers more expensive. It didn't make it criminal. And that's why we're still fighting the same battles a century later. Here's the ultimate horror of the Radium Girls story. The women's bodies are still radioactive. Over 100 years after they were poisoned, the radium in their bones continues emitting radiation. Some were buried in lead-lined coffins to contain the radiation. Others were buried normally, and their graves still register on Geiger counters. If you exhume a Radium Girl's body today, it will be radioactive. That's not metaphor. That's literal. The harm done to them is so severe, so permanent, that their remains are still toxic a century later. And the companies that poisoned them faced no criminal consequences. They paid settlements. They changed practices when forced to. But no one went to prison. No executives faced trial for knowingly poisoning workers. The complete history of the Radium Girls is the history of corporate America valuing profit over human life. It's the history of companies knowing their products kill people and covering it up anyway. It's the history of workers fighting for basic safety and dying while corporations fight them in court. Dozens of women dead, hundreds more harmed, bodies literally glowing from radiation poisoning. And the company's response was to lie, delay, discredit, and settle without admitting wrongdoing. That's not ancient history. That's corporate America's operating manual. The Radium Girls case established that playbook over a century ago, and corporations are still using it today. They have more sophisticated PR, they fund more research, they hire better lawyers, they settle faster to avoid publicity. But the fundamental calculation hasn't changed. Is harming people profitable? If yes, do it. If caught, deny it. If proven, fight it. If forced to pay, settle without admitting fault. Continue operating. That's the lesson of the Radium Girls. Not that corporate accountability is possible, but that corporate accountability requires workers dying, public outrage, years of legal battles, and overwhelming evidence before companies face even financial consequences. Criminal consequences? Prison time for executives who knowingly harm people? Still waiting. A century later, still waiting. The Radium Girls won compensation for themselves. They changed workers' rights law. They forced safety improvements in the radium industry. But they didn't change the fundamental dynamic. Corporations can kill people for profit as long as they're willing to pay settlements when caught. That's the complete history of the Radium Girls. Women poisoned for corporate profit. Bodies glowing in coffins. Years of suffering. A heroic lawsuit that changed workers' rights. And a playbook that corporations still use to harm people while avoiding criminal accountability. Dozens dead. 0 executives prosecuted. And the pattern continues. That's the Radium Girls. The women who died so corporations could save money on safety equipment. The lawsuit that proved workers could sue employers. The precedent that showed financial penalties matter more to corporations than human life. And their bodies are still radioactive, still glowing in their graves, still poisoned over a century later. That's what corporate greed does. It creates permanent harm, it destroys lives, and it faces only financial consequences, never justice.